As I say, we continue our journey to Lent here on the cusp of Holy Week. In this season of Lent, we turn our hearts and minds in a special way to God and ask them to be renewed by the mystery of Christ's death and resurrection during Holy Week and Easter, that our lives may be conformed more fully to Christ's life. And as I mentioned at the start of Mass also, it is March 17th, the feast of St. Patrick. It's a very important day here at Notre Dame, the home of the Fighting Irish. While our readings and prayers are from the fifth Sunday of Lent, we remember in a special way St. Patrick and all those of Irish descent. You likely have heard of the story of St. Patrick in Ireland. He was born in what is now England in the late 400s to Christian parents who were part of the leadership of the Roman Empire, then in power in that part of the world. Raiders came to his home when he was a youth, captured him, sold him as a slave in Ireland, where he labored for 6 years. After 6 years, he escaped and returned to his home. But when he was home, he had a vision asking him to return to Ireland to preach the gospel to the people of that country, who were for the most part pagans. After some study, Patrick was ordained and returned to Ireland. Although he met opposition and struggle, he is credited with bringing the people of Ireland to the Christian faith. There are numerous stories of clashes with local nobles and pagan priests, but through his faith, courage, and perseverance, Patrick spread the gospel of faith, making Ireland a land of faith and of saints. And in the early years of this university particularly, those who taught, studied, and led Notre Dame were largely people of Irish descent, people whose faith they brought to this new land and lived it. Notre Dame is deeply indebted to the heirs of Patrick's preaching. Patrick's story is the story of the spread of faith. Ireland became one of the world's most Catholic nations and courageously held to that faith, despite centuries of attempts to smash it out by English occupiers at the time. If you know much about Ireland today, though, you probably know that it's a land where people held the faith so tenaciously, but over the centuries there is a decline in its observance. Seminaries are less full, the churches are less full, the faith and the church has less influence over society. In Ireland, as in the U.S., in many places, the faith that spread so vigorously and took root and shaped the culture seems to be decreasing in observance and influence. There may be some parallel here with the story of the people of Israel, the story we hear about in our first reading from Jeremiah. The story of the people of Israel is the story of a people who were slaves in Egypt, but who were freed by God and led to the promised land. They flourished in this new land and eventually became a kingdom. In Jerusalem, they built a temple, the temple of the Lord, and it became the center of worship. The psalmist in Psalm 80 uses the metaphor of a vineyard to tell that story. He says, God, you brought a vine out of Egypt. You drove out the nations and planted it. You cleared the ground for it. It took root and filled the land. The mountains are covered with its shade, the mighty cedars with its branches. With time, though, as Jeremiah tells it, the people were not faithful to their covenant with God. Their land was conquered by the Babylonians. A puppet leader was placed on the throne. Eventually, the Babylonians invaded a second time, destroyed the temple, and destroyed the city of Jerusalem. Its people became exiles. The psalmist tells this part of the story as follows. Why, God, have you broken down the vineyard's walls, so that all who pass through it pluck its fruit? The boar of the forest ravages it, and all who move in the fields feed on it. Here too, then, is a story of the spread and triumph of faith through the power of God that is overturned. The promised land is conquered. The people are dispersed. The temple destroyed. So what does God do to his chosen people? Does he reestablish the temple and the land? Does he return to previous times? No, says the prophet Jeremiah. I will make a new covenant, says God. I will place my law within them and write it upon their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. God does not reestablish Jerusalem. He seeks to establish his kingdom rather deep in the hearts of his people. He writes his will, his law on their hearts. They will know him intimately. They will become even more profoundly his people. And perhaps, too, that's the story for our time. I sometimes find myself longing for a time when faith was more dominant, more influential, whether in Ireland or in this country or anywhere else, when faith was in the ascendancy, at least socially. But perhaps at this moment, God is calling us to a deeper, more genuine faith, a deeper relationship with him. The temple in Jeremiah's time, the social acceptance of faith in our time, these are factors external to us. They are good, but they may or may not touch our hearts. God may be asking us to enter our hearts ever more deeply, so that it is not in the exterior influences that our faith is supported, but rather God working in our hearts, writing his will there that will make him our God and we his people. That's really what the season of Lent is about, isn't it? We all are Catholics. We all have our baptismal certificates. We come to Mass. All that's very good. But at Lent, we strive to allow God to touch our hearts even more deeply. We are asked God to write his will on our hearts, to accept him in our inmost hearts and live accordingly, and thereby become powerful witnesses for faith for the world around us. In the gospel I just read, we find Greeks, people from other nations outside Israel, coming to speak with Jesus. They have heard his miracles. They've heard his teaching. They want to know more. And Jesus speaks then to his disciples not about ideas, but about his laying down his life and being lifted up in the crucifixion. The crucifixion is about Jesus' self-giving. That is what we are asked to imitate. It is in that self-giving that Jesus is lifted up, that he is exalted. That is the mystery of Good Friday and Easter, this giving of self that we are asked to shape our lives as well. This is the mystery that we long to have written on our hearts. The story we hear of St. Patrick is a tale of the spread of greater and greater faith and the spread of the gospel. The actual story is always more complex. As with Israel, there are conquests and regressions, losses and exiles. But in those moments of trial, God speaks to our hearts and asks us to listen. He asks that our faith may become more deep, more authentic, and we may become more fully God's own, individually and collectively, that we may imitate Christ more perfectly. To the extent we do, we preach the gospel with our lives to the people around us. So let us pray that as we approach Holy Week, we may be open to the God who wishes to write his law upon our hearts, to dwell in them, and draw us more deeply into the living mystery of Christ, the mystery of Easter season.